Hello, and welcome to The Wolves Are Among Us, a tale of APT's thievery. If you are joining us live, our speaker is in the Slido chat discussion area now, answering any questions. If you have any audio or video issues, please click the technical support button below. I'd now like to turn it over to Stefano Macaya for the presentation.
Hello, thank you for joining. So we'll speak about one case that involved the Middle East cyber espionage. Middle East is a quite busy place and stage for cyber espionage these days. The area is attractive both for locals and foreign attackers in the last 10 years. In our case, governmental agency requested assistance by a call to our staff based on the fact that they were already our customer, having our gear in place, but they were having some elements to discuss about finding of a compromise that was tagged back to August 2018. We were at October 2018, so 2 months. To carry out our engagement, we normally tend to speak if we have the chance to ensure full visibility on 3 main items: network visibility, host visibility, logs visibility. In this case, while the network visibility was good enough because it was already deployed into the network traffic going back and forth from the environment and internet, we were still having some issues about the availability of our endpoint product. But more important, we were still having a lot of visibility to gain from the environment based on the evidences the customer presented. It presented basically evidences of archive containing sensitive data recorded and created into a DMZ server where they are not supposed to be, and the creation date was August 18, 2018. We went into verifying, obviously, the system in the DMZ, but also because this lateral movement between files cannot be possible in this environment unless you have administrative level of grants, the Active Directory, and obviously the workstation. So we started digging into from the customer presenting evidence. The customer presented 5 apparently JPEG files, but in fact these files were archives, RAR archives. In this case, the potential attacker was not encrypting the free structure of the RAR file, so the victim was able to dig into the content of these RAR files, and he found the name of some obvious, sensitive, critical files of his own environment. So they raised immediately the call for us. And while we started investigating on this repo server, the one where these files were stored, we looked through the MFT as a typical IR analysis, and we found the presence of w.exe, that is basically a Windows credential editor, dropped on the system on an earlier date than the one presented by the customer as the potential initial date of the attack. In fact, in our case, the date of the w.exe, the Windows credential editor, was almost 9 months earlier, on the late December 2017. Together with the Windows credential editor, basically on the same time, a temporary file was created in another directory, in a temp folder in Windows. And looking into this folder, this file, we discovered a very significant number of credentials, domain credentials. The w.exe file, remarkably, was dropped into an IME folder. IME folder is an IME folder. IME folder is a folder that is present in Windows in every time the system is configured to have support for Eastern languages. So it's pretty common in the Middle East. And it's also pretty common for oil rig APT attacker, that is a local attacker of the area, to use this folder. We were having experience of this folder in previous cases. Looking to the temp file dropped by the credential editor, we have extracted in this presentation just a small excerpt of the entire file, but you can imagine, you can read, basically, the complexity and the easy guessable credential of some of these accounts. All these accounts were breached on late December. At this point, we attempted to review the logs of the system in order to highlight the source of the compromise. We started to look into the repo from the date of the file creation, and we discovered that few minutes earlier than the w.txt was dropped into the system itself was presenting logs of failed attempt of authentication from internal IP address that was 172.60.21.102. And thanks to this evidence, we tried to pinpoint who was the IP address behind, who was the host name behind this IP address. We look at to the DHCP because this segment of network was allowed by the DHCP release, but we were not lucky. We were more lucky through the proxy logs that was still having this IP address for that day. And through this, we were able to identify AS4, that is a system workstation belonging to an administrator that was seen creating all these actions. Reviewing the AS4, we immediately discovered that somebody on the date of the file creation in August 2018 was blocking the logs, so the system logs was not longer available, and it canceled the previous logs. But thanks to our tools, we were able to track on the same date the usage of this system for a number of net use, so basically lateral movement on SMB protocol. Unfortunately, no records were allowed for us to collect from December, just from August. However, we went through the AS4 and reviewing logs, IOCs, and other data sources. We highlighted a number of sessions that were targeting this system. And thanks to the review of network traffic and logs, we were able to scope that this AS4 system was, again, accessed laterally by another system. It was the Akimi host. This host was different than the AS4. AS4 is a workstation constantly installed and present in the customer environment, while the Akimi is a nomadic system. It's a laptop, and its owner, a lead developer, move back and forth from the environment and his own address. Our endpoint forensic solution was installed in the systems on January 2018. So we missed the chance to track the initial infection, but the persistent mechanism where we were able to track, and together with that, we highlighted two files, upd.vbs and the end of PS1. These two were both used by the attacker on different moments to ensure the primary and secondary channel to control this system, the Akimi laptop. The upd.vbs was the most interesting because it was camouflaged as a service to persist in the environment with the NVIDIA update name. After its execution, it was also downloading, first time, the end.ps1 on the same folder where it was present, fdata./local Microsoft Media. And these two files were basically allowing remote access by the attacker. Thanks to this finding, and thanks to the fact that we were having a scheduled task to look for in the other system, we highlighted other system infected, and thanks to that, we were able to track through the MFT analysis the way the attacker got in. The attacker got in through a weaponized Excel file, including a macro that was downloading and executing the VBS file, the upd.vbs file, and the second component, the end.ps1, was instead dropped directly by the execution of the VBS file. We were not able to collect again the original email targeting 5 users, internal users, as spear phishing, but we were able to collect the Excel file that was basically the attachment, the weaponized attachment. The execution of UPD.VBS is basically due to the usage of the XML engine parser of Windows. The original macro dropper used MS-XML2.XML HTTP. That is basically a component that allows a program that parses XML to connect to an external system, a web server, and potentially downloading or executing or reading files. In this case, the UPD.VBS was downloaded as Adobe Stream Object through this particular trick, and executed once downloaded through WScript shell, in the environment. So a typical mechanism of infection that is not really peculiar. We noticed several of these cases. However, peculiar was the fact that the persistent was adopted using scheduled tasks with the name NVIDIA update, and this was a very good IOC to track the other occurrences, and that once the VBS file has been data-rated, immediately it communicates with a C2, and in certain condition, it downloads the DN.PS1 and ensure a secondary channel to DNS tunneling for the same attacker to persist in the system and to communicate with this victim. Thanks to these findings, we were also able, reviewing the network forensic part, to highlight other infected systems. In this case, by focusing on AS4 and Akimi, we were also able to track Asker, that is another infected host of the same attacker. And we were also able to track the C2. In total, the attacker was using 3 C2s. One is highlighted here. They were using HTTP protocol, and they were using basically port 80, TCP port 80. At the end of the investigation process, it took about 2 weeks, full weeks, right, to collect all the evidences and to discuss and verify the findings. We were able to highlight the big picture of the oil rig attack. We target this, and we classified and attribute this to oil rig simply because some of the items we highlighted as malware were a typical part of the oil rig arsenal. This is absolutely not new for the ones that are exposed to oil rig attacks. We were counting about 5 systems plus the repo system where initially credentials being stolen, and it was also the one that the attacker leveraged upon to ensure, the collection of the exfil from the environment. In the end, we wrap up the remediation that was aimed to remove the threat from the environment and to rebuild the proper protection to the infrastructure. We were leveraging on rebuild of compromised machine, full domain password reset, removal of local authentication from all the systems. This was one of the most weakest, posture from the customer, the victim. This was one of the reasons for the attacker to have chance to spread easily. And the adoption in the remediation of 2-factor authentication for all VPN and removal of all the unused services accounts. However, during the investigation, there was just one weird file that was highlighted by our analyst that was not really fitting into the infection, into the attack. Was this where the VirtualBox driver, a legacy driver, 1.6.2 version that was already very old compared to the date of the investigation, that was found in another system. Based on our experience, drivers like this one are very, very, concerning, because there are a number of potential actions that can be carried out through the usage of this type of drivers in a potentially infected system. So In the end, we presented the evidence to the customer, and going deeper into this system that was called Almasi, we found through the MFT, and we were able to collect additional component. Additional component was basically the orchestrator of Geyser package from Epictura. Epictura is a totally different APT attacker, Russian of origin, and Russian speaker attacker, and it's pretty known into the cyber espionage, field, because several different IR teams, even ourselves, were investigating in the past previous infection by Epictura. Obviously, as soon as we discovered that, we immediately report in full the evidences to the customer. But he was not really surprised about this finding. And he stated that in 2016, so basically 2 years earlier, he was targeted by so-called Russians, and they were expelled in January 27. In fact, all the evidences were pointing to this particular attack, and this was apparently a remnant of the previous attack, not really removed, a sort of relic of the previous infection from Epictura. And in fact, no suspicious traffic was generated by the Almasi workstation during our investigation. So we, classify this as an important evidence to present, but in the end, not really fitting into the remediation process. Obviously, the machine has been removed and rebuilt, but from that perspective, no longer we investigate or we spend additional time on it. Obviously, we still were puzzled by the fact that the Trojan was injected into legitimate processes, and the driver was potentially used to execute malware, skipping the signature control of the Windows system. But having no evidence of any traffic, any malicious behavior, apart from the previous ones recorded, we just rebuilt or advised the customer to rebuild the machine. This is for posterity, and obviously, as you can notice, the Turla Geyser package is leveraging on 3 components. The loader, that is basically a dropper that loads the orchestrator, that is the real implant, through the VBox drive, that is basically the file that we discovered first on the Almasi workstation, and is just used as an auxiliary component in order to be able, from the loader, to inject the orchestrator in the system. Okay, we presented the remediation plan. The customer asked for a couple of months to carry out the entire process. Obviously, we were already blocking the communication of the CTUs, and we were watching the systems. But while we were advising the customer to block the IP addresses, the customer blocks instead only the protocols. So in the end, it was not really, was not really blocking every type of occurrence from the IP addresses of C2, leveraging on the monitoring part for the rest. When we get back and we were ready to complete the task, we went into the pre-flight check, and we discovered a very curious set of communication work streams into our network forensic component. So, as you can notice, in the red box was the original oil rig DNS traffic leveraging on DNS to communicate outbound to the C2, while from the 24th of October, late after the completion of our investigation, and when the customer started remediating, other machines started communicate with the same IP with a different protocol. This protocol is BITS protocol that the customer was allowing just because in his own idea, BITS was only usable by Microsoft for Microsoft updates, so it was allowed for any IP address in the net. In the end, our idea was that a different attacker, or at least a different malware, was used from the 24th of October. And going in deeper into the machines that were presenting this malware, we discovered that Epic Turla basically was having the upper end on the C2 of the original OIREG attacker and was using it with a new implant to control some system in the customer environment. So the machines that were communicating with bits were 4, and these were representing 2 components, 2 DLLs. These DLLs were configured to use bits protocol for communication. One was basically a loader. The second was, again, the real implant, similar to the Geyser package, but this is not Geyser. The Trojan was, once injected, was having 2 functions, 1W and 2W. The 1W was used to install the back and was called by the previous, the loader, while the 2W was used to activate the network socket to start communicating outbound. The DLL, even in this case, persisted with the scheduler task that you can see into the box. And this is basically a reconstruction of one of the sessions we collected from the ones that were presented into the previous slide from the network forensic, presenting the bits protocol and the way the Turla was using the bits protocol. So basically, the bits protocol was the header and the port, but obviously the rest was encrypted and was definitely not bits. However, this allowed the attacker to stretch his persistence during the investigation period, as the bits protocol was allowed in the perimeter. The Trojan, the loader, used run DLL TD2 to activate the implant. And all the processes were running through the legitimate run DLL TD2.exe process. Check commands were then used by the attacker to move laterally and to scan or to carry out additional tasks through SMB, as the previous attacker does in the previous infection, in the previous attack. At one point, investigating, we were trying to figure out if the attacker was leveraging, as we expected, to other C2, even because the attacker was pretty confident in the fact that we were remediating the OIREG attack. So at one point, following the flow of the original remediation, we configured the block, the total block of the IP address. So this implant, immediately after the block of the full IP address, of the full stack of the IP address used by the C2, start beaconing to another C2 with the same bits protocol. So thanks to that, and not really alerting the attacker, we were able to collect additional IOCs and obviously the other main C2. Together with that, in parallel, we ran investigation on other endpoints, and we were able to track an additional implant. This one is known as the Caswar implant, that is basically a Trojan written in .NET that was able to be executed on the signal system, only passing a precise set of parameters, in particular a pre-shared. So if you don't pass it, it doesn't work. And on the other hand, this malware was passed through SMB to other system, or was passed to the local system and executed locally, as you can notice in the tracking in the below table. Together with the evidence of the 2 implants, 2 malware, we also identified another very significant occurrence. The attacker, the Turla attacker, was able to implant a very peculiar backdoor in the OWA web server, in the Outlook Web Access servers, basically the web interfaces of the exchange of the governmental agency. And basically, through the items that depicted into the code in the red box, he was able to collect every new logon on OWA by any new or any password resetted account, and store the password passed through the interface of Outlook Web Access, storing it on a file called localcache.hdE. And it was published on a precise page into the OWA that was accessible only if you present a precise cookie header through your browser. And this is highlighted into the red box. So in the end, Turla was able to infect the Outlook Web Access servers in the way that every new access from any account was stored and the credential kept by the attacker, stored into a precise file, published on a specific page that was accessible only if you present your browser with a precise cookie that was hard-coded into the web page code. The web shell installed here was able to perform a specific set of actions that you can see down here. So the logic of the web shell was determined by the code that we have highlighted and was easily understand what it was able to do, kind of like dump, like execute file and other stuff like that. In addition, to lower the chance to get traced by our solution, the attacker used anonymizer IP services, presenting his cookie in a session to access the page where the new credentials were stored. So this is also another important aspect. And in the end of the investigation process, we were having this big picture. In fact, the Almasi system that was the first to be highlighted was not part of this new infection, but obviously was part of the previous infection of Epic Turla, while Epic Turla was leveraging on one of the oil rig infrastructure to get rid of some of the initial execution problems and part of the infection, the earliest part of the infection, and leverage on the other part that's a dedicated infrastructure for the following part of his persistence. By the way, through Mahini work session, the attacker was also able to use this infrastructure to access additional governmental agencies of the area. And this is another remarkable aspect. Okay, we obviously reported immediately all these findings. We obviously ran another engagement, basically, during this second step into customer environment. And we started, remediating, keeping the original plan, but obviously expanding it, including this other attacker. And it was absolutely challenging to face two attackers in the same engagement. And by the way, after the remediation, after the successful remediation that occurred on the early 2019, we went into discovering another occurrence of another attacker after Epic Turla on the March of 2019. This case was another local attacker of another country, basically, that was using another trick that is similar, however, to the one used by the O-ring, and it was basically through the spear phishing email. Okay, so speaking about the lesson learned, obviously we learned a lot in this engagement, in this challenging engagement. Some items we know about earlier, but in this case was extremely clear on our eyes that we do not need to assume that a customer remediation is necessarily prior to our analysis, is necessarily a success. And obviously we tell that it's important not to rely on the assumption that apparently unrelated infection can be investigated safely. Obviously do not assume sophisticated attacker is limited to the use of dedicated infrastructure. This is a precise example of one attacker using another attacker infrastructure to living off the land. Obviously, do not expect Epic Turla to behave like common APT groups, and moreover, do not expect Middle East to be a quiet place in these days. And obviously, as we always say, think positive and stay vigilant. Well, thank you very much, guys, for your participation to this presentation. and I am ready to follow up to your questions in the question and answer part. Thank you very much.